was 23 years old when I found the contract that proved my father had gambled me away like a poker chip. And the worst part wasn't that he'd bet his own daughter's future on a card game mitt, was that he'd spent the next 15 years pretending he was protecting me while actually hiding me from the consequences of his greed. My name is Emma Clark, and this is the story of how I discovered I'd been living in a cage built from lies, and how I tore it down brick by brick until the whole rotten structure collapsed on the man who built it. I'm telling you this now because silence protects the wrong people. And I've been silent long enough. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning when I was looking for my birth certificate in my father's study, a room I'd been forbidden to enter my entire life, but had finally decided to violate because I needed the document for a job application. The study was exactly what you'd expect from a man who valued control above everything: dark wood, cabinets, and that particular smell of old leather and older secrets. I found the birth certificate easily enough in the top drawer of his desk, but underneath it was a manila folder with my name written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking before I even opened it, some animal instinct warning me that whatever was inside would change everything. The contract was dated 15 years earlier, when I would have been 8 years old. Written in formal legal language that made my stomach turn as I translated it into plain English in my mind. My father, Thomas Clark, had entered into a gambling agreement with a man named Victor Ashworth, a property developer with connections to some very dangerous people. And when my father couldn't pay his debts, that had apparently climbed into 6 figures, he'd offered something else as collateral. Me. The contract stated that upon my 18th birthday, I would be transferred into Victor Ashworth's household to work as a domestic servant for a period of 10 years, with no wages, no freedom to leave, and no right to refuse. It was slavery dressed up in legal terminology, and my father had signed it with a flourish that I recognized from every birthday card he'd ever given me. I read that contract 7 times before my brain would accept what my eyes were seeing, each reading revealing new horrors hidden in the clauses and subclauses. There were provisions about my education limited to what was necessary for household management, provisions about my social contacts none permitted without explicit approval. Provisions about attempts to escape legal action would be taken against me and any family members who aided me. My father had sold me into servitude to cover his gambling debts. And then he'd spent the next 10 years making sure I'd never find out, never prepare, never escape. Everything suddenly made sense: the homeschooling that isolated me from other children, the lack of friends or outside activities, the way he monitored every phone call and every letter, the constant emphasis on obedience and duty and knowing your place in the world. I sat in that leather chair for 3 hours, reading and rereading, my mind cycling through shock and disbelief and a rage so pure it felt like swallowing fire. The man I'd called Dad, who'd tucked me in at night and taught me to ride a bicycle and cried at my piano recitals, had valued his own skin more than my freedom. He'd looked Victor Ashworth in the eye and agreed that yes, his daughter was an acceptable form of payment. He'd shaken hands on a deal that would have destroyed my life. And then he'd come home and kissed my forehead and told me he loved me. I thought about all the times he'd said he was keeping me home for my own protection. That the world was dangerous for young women. That he knew what was best. He'd been protecting himself, not me. Every restriction, every rule, every locked door had been about keeping me ignorant and compliant. Until the day Victor Ashworth came to collect his property. The folder contained more than just the contract. There were letters between my father and Ashworth, negotiations about the terms, discussions about my condition and suitability. They wrote about me the way you'd write about a car or a piece of furniture, assessing my value based on my health and appearance and docility. Ashworth had insisted on regular updates, and my father had provided them, complete with photographs that I now realized weren't just innocent family snapshots, but progress reports for my future owner. There was a letter from 2 years ago where Ashworth complained that my father was falling behind on the agreed timeline for my preparation, that I should have been more thoroughly trained in domestic duties and less educated in academic subjects. My father had apologized and promised to correct the imbalance. I'd thought he was being supportive when he paid for my online university courses in literature and history. He'd actually been defying Ashworth's orders. Perhaps the only decent thing he'd done in this entire nightmare. And even that was too little, too late. I took photographs of every document with my phone. My hands steadier now that shock was giving way to something colder and more focused. I wasn't the frightened 8-year-old girl my father had bartered away. And I wasn't the naive 23-year-old who'd walked into this study an hour ago. I was someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal, and I was going to burn down every bridge they'd tried to trap me on. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was facing. I needed to know exactly what powers they thought they had and what weapons I could use against them. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, smoothed out the wrinkles in the folder, closed the drawer with a soft click. My father couldn't know I'd discovered his secret. Not yet. Not until I was ready to use that knowledge like a blade. When he came home that evening, I watched him with new eyes, cataloging every gesture and expression for signs of the monster hiding behind the father mask. He asked about my day in that same warm voice he'd always used, and I told him it had been quiet, uneventful, boring, even all lies, just like his entire life had been a lie to me. He smiled and patted my shoulder and said he was glad I was safe at home where I belonged. And I smiled back and agreed. and the whole performance made me want to scream until my throat was raw. But I didn't scream. I played the role of the obedient daughter one more time because I needed him to believe nothing had changed. Needed him to think his secrets were still safe in their locked drawer while I planned my escape and his ruin. That night, I started my research, learning everything I could about Victor Ashworth and the kind of man who would accept a human being as payment for a debt. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Ashworth was wealthy and well-connected, with a legitimate business empire and a shadow network of less legitimate enterprises. He'd been investigated multiple times for labor violations and exploitation, but charges never seemed to stick because witnesses had a habit of changing their testimony or disappearing altogether. He had friends in the police force, friends in the courts, friends in the newspapers. He was untouchable in the way that very rich, very ruthless men often are, protected by layers of money and fear. The thought of ending up in his household, subject to his control with no legal recourse, made my skin crawl. But I also learned something useful. He was arrogant. Men like him always are. They believe their money and power make them invincible. And that arrogance creates blind spots. I spent the next 3 weeks digging deeper, using the research skills my online university courses had taught me to piece together a picture of Ashworth's operations. I found news articles about former employees who'd tried to speak out about working conditions, online forums where people shared stories about his business practices, public records that showed a pattern of lawsuits settled quietly out of court. I found the families he'd destroyed, the lives he'd ruined, the trail of human wreckage he'd left in his wake while building his empire. And I found something else. I found that I wasn't alone. There were others he'd victimized, actors who wanted to see him face consequences, but didn't have the evidence or the courage or the platform to make it happen. I started reaching out carefully, anonymously at first, building connections with people who had their own reasons to want Ashworth exposed. We were a scattered army of the wronged, and I was going to turn us into a weapon. The legal research was harder because, I had to be careful not to leave traces my father might find if he checked my browsing history. I used public libraries and internet cafes, created anonymous email accounts, learned to cover my digital tracks like a spy in a thriller novel. I discovered that the contract my father had signed, while appearing official and binding, actually had some significant legal problems. Contracts involving personal servitude are generally unenforceable in the UK, and any agreement that violates basic human rights is void, regardless of what signatures appear on the paper. My father and Ashworth had essentially created an elaborate piece of illegal fiction and convinced themselves it had power. But I also learned that proving the contract was illegal and stopping them from trying to enforce it were two different things. Men like Ashworth don't care about legal niceties when they want something. They care about power and fear and the appearance of inevitability. I needed allies. Real ones, not just online contacts, but people with actual authority and ability to help. I spent hours composing an email to a solicitor who specialized in human rights cases, trying to explain my situation without sounding insane or paranoid. I attached photographs of the contract and the letters, laid out the timeline of events, explained my father's control over my life and Ashworth's intentions. I hit send before I could second-guess myself and then sat staring at my inbox, willing a response to appear. It came 3 days later. The solicitor, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, wanted to meet with me immediately. She said my case was one of the most disturbing things she'd encountered in 20 years of practice. And she wanted to help me not just escape, but ensure both men faced serious consequences. For the first time since finding that contract, I felt something other than rage and fear. I felt hope. Sarah Mitchell was exactly what I need. Sharp, experienced, and absolutely furious on my behalf when she heard the full story. She explained that while the contract itself was unenforceable, my father and Ashworth had likely committed multiple crimes in creating and attempting to execute it, including conspiracy, fraud, and potentially human trafficking. She said we could go to the police, but she recommended a different approach. We build an absolutely airtight case first. Gather every piece of evidence. Document every communication. And then we strike all at once in a way that makes it impossible for them to wriggle free or intimidate us into silence. She said men like Ashworth are used to making problems disappear quietly. So we needed to make sure this problem was too loud and too public to disappear. I agreed immediately. I didn't want a quiet settlement or a private apology, wanted justice. The kind that leaves a permanent mark. The next phase of the plan involved pretending everything was normal while secretly preparing for war. And it was harder than I'd anticipated. I had to sit across from my father at dinner and make small talk while my phone recorded our conversations, capturing his mentions of keeping me safe and protecting me from the world. That would later prove his intent to isolate me. I had to endure his lectures about duty and family and trust, all while knowing he was the one who'd betrayed every principle he claimed to value. I had to watch him lie to my face day after day, and I had to lie right back. And the weight of all that deception was crushing, even though I knew my lies were in service of truth and his were in service of cowardice. Some nights I'd lie awake wondering if I was becoming like him, calculating and cold. But then I'd remember that the difference between us was that Ka was lying to expose the truth while he'd lied to bury it. Sarah helped me establish my independence carefully and strategically. Opening a bank account my father didn't know about, getting a private phone line, creating an escape fund from the small allowance I'd managed to save over the years. We prepared a safe house where I could stay if things went wrong. People who would vouch for my whereabouts. A network of protection in case Ashworth tried something desperate when he realized his prize was slipping away. Every step was planned with paranoid precision because we both knew what could happen if we moved too soon or left any openings for them to strike first. Sarah had seen too many cases where victims were re-victimized by the legal system itself, where the people with money and power could twist justice to suit their needs. And she was determined not to let that happen to me. I also started gathering evidence of my father's gambling problem, the root of this entire nightmare. I found betting slips hidden in coat pockets, bank statements showing transfers to online casinos, receipts from racetracks and card rooms. I pieced together a picture of a man with an addiction he couldn't control and debts he couldn't pay. A man who'd destroyed his own life through greed and weakness and then decided to destroy mine too, rather than face the consequences of his actions. I found the exact timeline of when the debts had grown critical. When he'd first approached Ashworth about alternative payment arrangements. When he'd made the final decision to offer his own daughter as collateral. I could see the moment in the bank records when he'd received a large cash payment. Ashworth buying time, buying silence, buying me, and I could see how quickly that money had been gambled away again. My father hadn't even valued me enough to stay bought. The hardest part was confronting the loss of my childhood. The realization that so many moments I'd treasured had been poisoned by his secret. Every birthday party had been a countdown to the day I'd be handed over. Every accomplishment had been measured against my future value to Ashworth. Every expression of love had been undercut by the knowledge that he loved his own comfort more than my freedom. I grieved for the father I thought I had. The man who'd existed only in my imagination. And I grieved for the girl I'd been who'd trusted him completely. That innocence was gone forever, burned away by truth, and I'd never get it back, no matter how this ended. But I also realized that maybe innocence wasn't worth keeping if it meant staying blind to reality. And maybe the person I was becoming, harder, wiser, angrier, was exactly who I needed to be to survive this. Sarah and I decided the right time to strike was approaching. We had the evidence. We had the legal arguments. We had the media contacts who'd be interested in a story about modern-day slavery and parental betrayal. But I wanted one more thing before we went public. I wanted to confront my father directly. Wanted to see his face when he realized I knew. Wanted to give him one chance to come clean and cooperate, or dig himself deeper into the hole he'd created. Sarah advised against it, said direct confrontation was risky and emotionally dangerous, but I insisted. I needed to look him in the eye and let him know that his victim had figured out the game and rewritten the rules. I needed him to understand that I wasn't the helpless little girl he'd traded away, was the instrument of his reckoning. I planned the confrontation for a Saturday evening when I knew we'd be alone in the house. No interruptions. No escape routes. I set up my phone to record everything, positioned it carefully on a bookshelf where the camera would capture both our faces. I made tea with trembling hands and carried it into the living room where my father sat reading the newspaper, oblivious to what was coming. I said, "Dad, we need to talk about Victor Ashworth." And I watched the color drain from his face like water circling a drain. He knew. In that instant, I saw him realize that his secret was out, that the walls he'd built around his lies were crumbling. And the look in his eyes was pure panic. Good. Let him feel a fraction of the fear I'd felt when I'd first read that contract and understood what he'd done. He tried to deny it at first, stammering something about not knowing what I was talking about, suggesting I must be confused or mistaken. I pulled out my own copy of the contract and laid it on the coffee table between us. Oh. And I watched him stare at it like it was a snake that might strike. I said, "I know everything. I know about the gambling debts. I know about the deal you made. I know you spent the last 15 years hiding me away so Ashworth could claim me like a package when I turned 18. I know you were going to let him enslave me to save your own miserable skin." My voice was steady and cold, and I barely recognized it as my own. He reached for the contract with shaking hands, and I said, "That's a copy. I have the originals, along with all your letters and emails and bank records. I have everything." His first response wasn't an apology, was a justification. He said I didn't understand the pressure he'd been under. The threats Ashworth had made, the impossible situation he'd found himself in through no fault of his own. He said he'd been trying to protect me by keeping me hidden, that he'd planned to find a way out of the contract before it came due, that he'd been working on solutions I couldn't possibly understand. He said everything except "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong," or "I should never have put you in that position." Oh. Every word out of his mouth was an excuse, a rationalization, a deflection of responsibility onto circumstances or other people or his own supposed good intentions. I listened to him dig himself deeper and deeper, and I felt the last threads of love and respect I'd had for him snap, one by one like rotting rope. When he finally ran out of justifications, I told him exactly what was going to happen next. I told him that I'd already consulted with a solicitor, that we were preparing to go to the police and the press, that the contract and all the supporting evidence would become public record. I told him that both he and Ashworth would face criminal charges and civil liability, that their names would be destroyed, that everyone would know what kind of men they really were. I told him he had one chance to get ahead of this. He could come with me to the police, confess everything, testify against Ashworth, and maybe, just maybe, face less severe consequences for cooperating. I told him he had 24 hours to decide, and that if he chose to fight or flee, I would pursue him with every resource I had until he faced justice. Then I picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and walked out of the room while he sat there looking 10 years older than he had an hour before. He didn't take the deal. I suppose I'd known he wouldn't. Cowards rarely find courage even when it's their last chance at redemption. Instead, he called Ashworth to warn him. And I know this because Sarah had anticipated this possibility and had already established a contact inside Ashworth's organization, who fed us information. The contact told us that Ashworth and my father had panicked, had talked about destroying evidence, had discussed ways to discredit me or intimidate me into silence. They'd even discussed trying to enforce the contract immediately. Having Ashworth's people simply take me by force and deal with the legal consequences later. That conversation was our gift. It was conspiracy caught on tape. It was proof of ongoing criminal intent. And it gave Sarah everything she needed to move forward with complete confidence. We were no longer just making accusations. We had evidence of crimes being committed in real time. Sarah notified the police, providing them with copies of all our evidence and explaining the immediate danger I might be in. They took it seriously. Modern slavery cases are high profile in the UK. And the involvement of a wealthy businessman like Ashworth made it even more sensitive. They assigned officers to watch my father's house and Ashworth's properties, placed alerts on my passport and ID documents in case anyone tried to use them, and began building their own case in parallel with our civil action. Sarah arranged for me to stay in a protected location, a safe house run by a charity that helps trafficking victims. And I spent 3 days there in a kind of surreal limbo while the machinery of justice slowly ground into motion. I felt like I was watching my own life from the outside, like I was a character in a story rather than a person living through real events. Everything felt unreal except for my anger, which remained sharp and clear and sustaining. The police raided both my father's house and, Ashworth's main office on the same morning. Coordinated operations designed to prevent evidence destruction. They seized computers, phones, filing cabinets full of documents, everything they needed to build an overwhelming case. My father was arrested at home, and according to the officers who'd conducted the raid, he'd collapsed in tears and started confessing immediately, throwing Ashworth under the bus in a desperate attempt to save himself. Ashworth was arrested at his office, and in contrast to my father's immediate breakdown, he'd refused to say anything without his lawyers present, already playing the long game of legal defense. The arrests made the evening news. Wealthy developer charged in modern Roush slavery case, and my phone exploded with messages from distant relatives and old family friends who'd had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. I ignored them all. Their concern came too late to matter. The media coverage was intense and overwhelming. exactly what Sarah had predicted and prepared me for. The story had everything journalists love: wealth, betrayal, a young woman escaping servitude, the dark underbelly of respectable society. My name was protected because I was considered a victim and because I was pursuing criminal charges. But my father and Ashworth were named and photographed and dissected in every newspaper and on every news website. Ashworth's business partners started distancing themselves immediately, canceling contracts and issuing statements about how shocked and disappointed they were, even though some of them must have known or at least suspected what kind of man he really was. My father's neighbors gave interviews about how quiet and normal he'd seemed, how they'd never suspected anything wrong, how you can never really know people. I watched it all from my safe house, feeling disconnected from the circus, but also grimly satisfied that the truth was finally being told. The legal process was slow and frustrating, full of delays and motions and procedural complications that tested my patience and my resolve. Ashworth's expensive lawyers tried every tactic, arguing the contract was a joke or a misunderstanding, claiming he'd never intended to enforce it, suggesting I was mentally unstable or had been manipulated by my solicitor into making false accusations. They tried to paint him as a legitimate businessman who'd made a simple loan to a friend. Hen had been betrayed when that friend created a bizarre document without his knowledge. But the evidence was too strong, too detailed, too damning. The letters in Ashworth's own handwriting, the emails from his personal account, the testimony from my father, who was desperately cooperating in hopes of leniency. It all added up to an undeniable picture of intentional criminality. The prosecutors were confident, and Sarah was confident, and slowly, painfully, I began to allow myself to believe that justice might actually happen. My father pled guilty to multiple charges, including child abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit forced labor. And in exchange for his cooperation against Ashworth, he received a sentence of 8 years. 8 years for stealing 15 years of my life, for selling me like property, for building a cage around my childhood and calling it love. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was something. The judge's statement at sentencing was scathing, calling my father's actions a profound betrayal of the most fundamental duties of parenthood, and noting that his gambling addiction didn't excuse or explain his willingness to sacrifice his daughter's freedom for his own benefit. My father cried in court, and I felt nothing watching him cry. The man I'd loved was already dead, this weeping stranger in a defendant's dock was just the corpse I'd finally learned to recognize. Ashworth's trial was longer and more complex because he had more resources to fight with and because he refused to accept any responsibility. He took the stand in his own defense and lied smoothly and confidently, portraying himself as a victim of my father's desperation and my vindictiveness. He claimed he'd tried to help my father with his financial problems and had been repaid with false accusations. He said the contract was something my father had created and forged his signature on, that the letters were fabricated, that he'd never seen me before the trial and certainly had never intended to hold me in servitude. His performance was polished and almost convincing, and I could see some members of the jury wavering, uncertain what to believe. But then the prosecution presented testimony from 3 other women who'd worked in too. Swarth's household over the past decade. Women who described conditions that amounted to imprisonment, who'd been threatened and exploited and treated as less than human. The pattern was undeniable. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. Ashworth's sentence was 15 years. And unlike my father, he showed no remorse, no tears, no breakdown. He stood stone-faced as the judge detailed his crimes and described him as a man who viewed other human beings as commodities to be bought and used. He was remanded into custody immediately, and as they led him away, he looked directly at me for the first time during the entire trial. His expression was pure hatred, undiluted fury that I dared to resist him. Audacity to fight back instead of accepting my fate quietly. That look sustained me through the difficult weeks that followed. It was proof that I'd hurt him, that I'd taken something he valued, that I'd won. He'd wanted to own me, and instead I'd destroyed him. The power balance had flipped completely, and we both knew it. The civil cases were almost anticlimactic after the drama of the criminal trials. Ashworth's assets were frozen, and many would eventually be liquidated to pay damages to his various victims. And my father had nothing left worth taking. Sarah helped me file for compensation through the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. And I received a substantial award that acknowledged, in cold financial terms, the damage done to my life and prospects. The money was useful. It gave me independence and security and the resources to rebuild my life however I chose. But it couldn't buy back my childhood or restore my trust in people or erase the knowledge of what my own father had been willing to do to me. Some damages can't be quantified in pounds sterling. Some wounds don't close no matter how much compensation you receive. In the aftermath, I had to figure out who I was, now that I wasn't defined by my father's lies or Ashworth's intentions. I'd spent my entire life in a cage I hadn't known existed.
Oh?
And now the door was open, but I didn't know how to walk through it. I started therapy, talking through the trauma with a counselor who specialized in trafficking survivors. Slowly untangling the knots of betrayal and fear and anger that had become my emotional landscape. I reconnected with the outside world cautiously, making friends, exploring interests, doing all the normal things I should have been doing years earlier. I went to university properly, not just online courses. but actual campus life with other students and professors and all the chaotic energy of young people figuring themselves out. I dated tentatively and sometimes disastrously. Learning to trust again while carrying the knowledge that the first man I'd ever trusted had sold me out. It was hard. Some days it was impossibly hard. But I kept moving forward because the alternative was letting them win retroactively. I also used my experience to help others, connecting with anti-trafficking organizations and victim support groups, sharing my story in the hopes it might help someone else recognize the warning signs of exploitation. I learned that my situation, while extreme, wasn't as unique as I'd hoped. There are more people trapped in various forms of modern slavery than most people realize. Hidden in plain sight, too afraid or too controlled to reach out for help. I spoke at conferences and fundraisers, gave interviews to journalists and researchers, became a kind of reluctant advocate because I had a platform and a story and the luxury of speaking out without fear. Some survivors told me I was brave, but I didn't feel brave. Felt like I'd had no choice but to fight or be destroyed. And fighting had just been the more appealing option. Bravery suggests you had alternatives. I'd been backed into a corner with nowhere to go but forward. My relationship with the concept of family changed fundamentally and probably permanently. I had cousins and aunts and uncles who'd been part of my childhood. But after the trial, most of them disappeared from my life. Either because they were ashamed of the association or because they blamed me for exposing the family's dirty secrets. A few reached out with apologies and explanations. They'd thought my father was just overprotective. They'd had no idea something so sinister was happening. They wished they'd paid more attention and asked more questions. I appreciated the sentiment, but couldn't fully forgive the blindness. Couldn't help wondering how they'd all failed to notice that something was deeply wrong in our household. Maybe they hadn't wanted to notice. Maybe it had been easier to accept the surface story and not look too closely at the cracks underneath. People have an enormous capacity to avoid seeing things that would require uncomfortable action if acknowledged. I created my own chosen family instead, friends who knew my whole story and accepted me anyway. People who'd proven their trustworthiness through action rather than blood relation. Sarah became a mentor and friend, helping me navigate the legal aftermath and offering advice on life decisions with the wisdom of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness but somehow maintained her faith in human goodness. The other survivors I'd met through advocacy work became a network of mutual support. People who understood the specific texture of betrayal and exploitation without needing lengthy explanations. We celebrated each other's victories and supported each other through setbacks. And in a strange way, the community born from our shared trauma became one of the most life-affirming parts of my healing process. We'd all been hurt by people who should have protected us, and we were learning to protect each other instead. The nightmares took years to fade. And even now, more than 5 years after the trial, I sometimes wake up gasping from dreams where I'm back in my father's house and the walls are closing in and I can't remember how to escape. I dream about the day Ashworth was supposed to come for me. Imagine scenarios where I didn't find the contract in time, where I ended up in his household with no way out and no one coming to save me. In these dreams, I'm powerless and voiceless again, reduced to the object my father and Ashworth had tried to make me. But then I wake up in my own apartment, surrounded by my own choices and my own life. And I remind myself that those are just dreams, and the reality is that I fought and I won, and they're both in prison, where they belong. The fear is real, but the danger is past, and that distinction matters. I survived. I more than survived, I prevailed. I think a lot about the version of myself who walked into my father's study that Tuesday morning, naive and trusting and completely unprepared for what she was about to discover. She feels like a different person now, someone I used to be in another lifetime. I grieve for her innocence, and I'm grateful for her curiosity. If she hadn't gone looking for that birth certificate, if she just accepted her father's rules and boundaries, I might have ended up exactly where they'd planned to put me. The discovery was traumatic, but it was also salvation. Knowledge, even terrible knowledge, is better than ignorance when ignorance keeps you trapped. I wish I could go back and warn her, prepare her for the shock, but I also know she wouldn't believe me if I did. Sometimes you have to walk through the fire to understand that you're capable of surviving the burn. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does, replaced by newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But the impact of the case lingered in useful ways. The legal community started paying more attention to contracts that might constitute modern slavery. And there were discussions about strengthening laws to prevent the kinds of loopholes Ashworth had tried to exploit. My case was cited in parliamentary debates about human trafficking and domestic servitude, held up as an example of how exploitation can hide behind seemingly legitimate business arrangements and family structures. I gave testimony to a committee studying these issues. And while I have no illusions that my words alone changed anything, I know they contributed to a larger conversation that needed to happen. Every voice matters when you're trying to shift cultural understanding of what slavery actually looks like in modern Britain needs, not always chains and ships. Sometimes it's contracts and control and fathers who value their own comfort over their daughter's freedom. I wrote a book about my experience. Not this exact account, but a more detailed memoir that covered everything from my isolated childhood to the moment the trial ended. It was partially therapeutic getting the whole story down on paper, organized into chapters, given narrative shaped, partially activist, wanting to reach as many people as possible with the message that these things happen and we need to be alert to the signs. The book sold well, better than I'd expected. And I used most of the royalties to fund a charity that helps trafficking victims with legal fees and safe housing. If something positive could emerge from my nightmare, this was it, taking the money people paid to read about my suffering and converting it into resources for people still trapped in their own suffering. The irony of profiting from trauma wasn't lost on me. But I tried to channel that profit toward redemption rather than just personal gain. Some people asked me if I ever forgave my father, especially after he'd served several years of his sentence and had apparently found religion in prison and written me letters full of apologies and biblical references. I didn't respond to the letters. I didn't forgive him. Forgiveness is something we're taught to value as a virtue. But I learned that it's not mandatory, and its absence doesn't make you a bad person. My father made choices that shattered my world, and he made them over and over again for years. Every single day, choosing his own interests over my well-being. The fact that he eventually felt bad about it, that prison was unpleasant, and regret was painful, didn't obligate me to absolve him or welcome him back into my life. Forgiveness is a gift, and he hadn't earned it. Maybe that makes me hard or uncharitable, but I'd rather be hard than a victim again. I'd rather be uncharitable than pretend that words on paper can undo actions in the world. Ashworth never apologized, never showed remorse, maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration despite all the evidence to the contrary. In a strange way, I respected his consistency more than my father's convenient religious conversion. At least, Ashworth was honestly terrible rather than performing repentance for an audience. He appealed his conviction multiple times and lost every appeal. Each failed attempt documented in legal journals as precedent for future cases. He became a cautionary tale, a name synonymous with modern slavery and exploitation. His business empire dismantled, and his reputation destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. I followed the appeals process carefully, needing to know that he was truly locked away and wouldn't find some legal loophole that would put him back on the streets. When his final appeal was denied, I opened a bottle of champagne and toasted to justice, delayed but not denied. It felt good to celebrate his definitive defeat. I eventually moved away from London, away from the city where everything had happened, seeking a fresh start in a place with no associations with my past. I found a small town by the sea where nobody knew my story unless I chose to tell it, where I could be just Emma. Not the girl whose father gambled her away or the trafficking survivor, or any of the other labels that had been attached to me. I got a job teaching English literature at a local college, and I found genuine joy in helping students discover the power of stories and language. I adopted a dog who'd been rescued from an abusive situation, and we healed together, two damaged creatures learning to trust again. I made friends with my neighbors, joined a book club, and joined a gym to live my smooth, healthy, and happy life.